The first frost had arrived at the Abbey with a silent and silver precision that turned the ivy of the cloisters into a frozen tapestry of white. The air on the mountain was no longer the damp and mineral breath of the well, but a sharp and crystalline cold that signaled the true onset of the winter. Elder Julian stood in the center of the Great Refectory, and he looked at the massive stone hearth that dominated the northern wall. This was the hearth of the ancestors, and it had provided the warmth and the light for the brothers for over 3 centuries. But the years of constant heat and the weight of the massive oak logs had taken their toll. The back wall of the firebox was cracked, and the mortar had turned to a fine and gray dust, and the heavy stone lintel was showing signs of a dangerous fatigue. The heart of the Abbey's warmth was failing, and before the first deep snows arrived, Julian had to perform the ritual of the restoration of the flame. He moved his workspace into the great hall, and the environment was a stark contrast to the open slopes or the dark well. The air was dry and smelled of old wax and wood smoke, and the high vaulted ceilings swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Julian spread his heavy canvas drop cloths over the polished stone floor, and he began the process of the dismantling. He used a small and pointed iron bar to gently pry the cracked firebricks from the rear of the hearth. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and constant sound in the vast silence of the hall. He was not just removing old stone, he was clearing the path for the new heat. He felt the residual warmth of the stones even through the leather of his gloves, a memory of the thousands of fires that had burned in this space. He reached into the dark throat of the chimney, and he began to clear the soot and the debris that had gathered on the smoke shelf. The soot was a fine and velvet black powder that coated his hands and turned the skin of his forearms into a map of the shadows. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the soot was the physical evidence of the Abbey's history, and he treated it with a quiet and profound respect. He used a stiff brush to scrub the interior of the flue, and the sound was a rhythmic and dry rasp that echoed through the great hall. He was looking for the structural integrity of the stone. He was searching for the point where the masonry met the heat and the wind. The second ritual of the morning was the selection of the firebricks. Julian had spent the previous week in the Abbey foundry casting a series of specialized bricks made of a mixture of local clay and ground volcanic basalt. These were the sunstones, and they were designed to absorb the intense heat of the fire and radiate it back into the room long after the logs had turned to ash. He took the first of the sunstones from his wooden crate, and he felt the immense density and the smooth texture of the material. It was a deep and earthy red, a color that promised warmth and protection. He began to lay the first course of the new firebox, and he moved in a slow and rhythmic cadence. He used a thin and refined mortar made of fireclay and fine sand to bond the bricks. He did not use the heavy and coarse mortar of the exterior walls. The hearth required a delicate touch of masonry of the interior that was both strong and flexible. Julian applied the mortar with a small iron trowel, and he watched as the red clay settled into the joints. He placed the first brick at the center of the back wall, and he tapped it into place with a small wooden mallet. The sound was a short and muffled report that seemed to ground the entire room. He was building the shield of the flame, and he felt the weight of the responsibility in the center of his chest. As the courses of the firebricks began to rise, Julian focused on the angle of the coving. The back wall of a great hearth must lean forward with a subtle and graceful curve to push the heat into the room and the smoke into the flue. Julian used his hands to guide the curve, feeling for the hidden geometry of the heat. He was the listener of the flame, and he understood the way the air moved through the stone. He placed the second and third courses with a meticulous care, ensuring that the overlaps were perfect and the joints were tight. The firebox was no longer a separate collection of bricks. It was becoming a singular and unyielding vessel for the light. The physical toll of the indoor work was different from the labor on the terrace. The air was still and the space was confined, and Julian felt the heat of his own exertion settling into his muscles. He felt the pull in his core and the steady ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the sensation. It was the evidence of his presence in the center of the restoration. He looked at his hands, and he saw the contrast between the deep tone of his skin and the bright red of the fireclay. He felt a profound sense of belonging to the craft. He was the one who provided the stability and the warmth and the rooted strength of the Abbey. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his work was the bridge between the cold of the winter and the comfort of the fire. By the time the firebox was half complete, the light in the great hall had begun to turn into a soft and amber glow. The sun was moving across the high windows, and the reflections of the stained glass were dancing on the stone floor. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the hearth, and he saw the way the new stones were beginning to glow with an internal light. The hearth was no longer a cold and broken void. It was a sanctuary of sound and stone. He thought about the brothers who would gather here in the evenings to follow, and the way the fire would provide the warmth for their prayers and their conversations. He was not just building a fireplace. He was participating in the long and unbroken history of the community. He reached for the next course of bricks, and he began the process of the lintel support. The heavy stone lintel above the hearth was a massive piece of gray granite, and it carried the weight of the entire chimney breast. Julian had to ensure that the new firebricks provided a solid and unyielding foundation for the weight. He used a series of small lead shims to adjust the height of the bricks, and he checked the level with a meticulous eye. He was building for the pressure of the mountain and the heat of the fire. He felt the vibration of the Abbey through the stones, and he knew that the foundation was secure. The heart of the flame was being restored, and the masonry was true. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the great hall as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final rest of the day. He looked at the hearth, and he saw the way the red bricks were holding the light of the afternoon sun. The ritual of the restoration was well underway, and the spirit of the flame was being invited back into the stone. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the red clay and the black soot, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the hearth, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the exit, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. The morning light filtered through the high, narrow windows of the Great Refectory, casting long and dusty beams across the polished stone floor. Elder Julian stood before the hollowed-out shell of the hearth of the Ancestors, and he felt the immense silence of the hall wrapping around him. The vertical walls of the new firebox were settled and firm, but the most critical component of the restoration was still waiting at the edge of the workspace. This was the great hearthstone, a singular and massive slab of gray granite that would form the floor of the fireplace. It was the shield that protected the Abbey from the hunger of the flame, and the anchor that held the entire structure to the earth. He began the process of the bedding. Before the granite could be moved into its permanent home, Julian had to prepare the foundation of the floor. He used a small shovel to spread a thick layer of fine mountain sand across the base of the hearth. The sand was cool and dry, and it carried the scent of the high peaks and the ancient minerals. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands were dark and textured against the pale grit. He used a wooden straightedge to level the sand, ensuring that there were no ridges or hollows that could create a point of tension beneath the stone. He was building for the weight of the mountain and the heat of the fire, and he understood that the smallest grain of sand could determine the stability of the century. Once the bed was leveled, Julian turned his attention to the granite slab. The stone was nearly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, and it carried a thickness of nearly 5 inches. It was a beautiful piece of mineral history with flecks of silver mica that caught the morning light like trapped stars. To move such a weight, Julian used a series of short wooden rollers made of seasoned oak. He placed the rollers beneath the leading edge of the granite, and he used a heavy iron pry bar to coax the stone forward. The sound was a low and heavy rumble of vibration that traveled through the soles of his boots and settled in his marrow. He did not rush the movement. He was the listener of the weight, and he understood that the stone would only move when it was ready to surrender its inertia. The transition from the rollers to the sand bed was the most delicate part of the ritual. Julian braced his legs against the masonry of the firebox, and he applied a steady and measured pressure to the pry bar. He felt the muscles in his arms and his back tightening with the effort, and the sweat began to carve channels through the fine black soot on his forehead. He guided the granite slab as it slid off the last roller and settled onto the sand. The sound was a deep and muffled thud, a resonance of finality that seemed to anchor the entire great hall. The stone was home. It was no longer a separate entity. It was now the floor of the flame. Julian knelt in the dust, and he began the process of the seeding. He used a heavy wooden mallet to tap the edges of the granite, ensuring that the stone was perfectly seated within the sand. He moved in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his breath was a constant and calming sound in the silence. He was listening for the resonance of the strike. A hollow sound would mean an air pocket was hidden beneath the stone, and a sharp ring would mean a point of tension. He waited until he heard the deep and solid thud that spoke of a perfect union. He was satisfied. The hearthstone was one with the earth, and it was ready to take the heat of the coming winter. The final adjustment of the hearthstone required the use of the water level. Julian took a shallow ceramic bowl and he filled it to the brim with clear mountain water. He placed the bowl at the center of the granite slab and he watched the surface of the liquid. The water was a silent and honest witness to the geometry of the work. If the bowl showed a slight tilt, he would use a lead shim to raise the stone. Julian moved with a quiet and meticulous care, and his hands were dark against the silver grain of the granite. He found a minute discrepancy at the northern corner, and he used his pry bar to lift the slab just a fraction of an inch. He slid a thin sliver of lead beneath the stone, and he watched as the water in the bowl settled into a still and perfect mirror. The hearthstone was now perfectly horizontal, a flat and unyielding plane of strength. This was more than just a technical requirement for Julian. It was a matter of the spirit. A hearth that was not level would eventually crack under the heat, and a spirit that was not balanced would eventually break under the pressure of the world. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The foundation of the warmth was true, and the masonry was solid. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the keeper of the balance. With the stone leveled, Julian began the final dressing. He took a small and pointed chisel, and he began to refine the edge of the granite where it met the firebricks of the firebox. He worked with a quiet and intense focus, and the sound of the metal against the stone was a high and rhythmic song that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory. He was removing the rough edges and the jagged protrusions, ensuring that the joint was tight and the spirit of the masonry was clean. The dust from the granite was a fine and silver powder that coated his fingers and turned his knuckles into a landscape of mineral history. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the grit. He saw the scars from the flint and the calluses from the granite, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was not just building a fireplace. He was building a testament to the patience of the man and the permanence of the Abbey. He thought about the brothers who would sit on this hearthstone in the years to follow, and the way the stone would hold the heat and provide the comfort. He was a part of their future, and they were a part of his legacy. The stone was the bridge between the generations, and he was the one who built the crossing. As the afternoon light began to fade, Julian gathered his tools and he prepared for the final cleaning of the workspace. He used a soft brush to remove the dust from the surface of the hearthstone, and he felt the smooth and cool texture of the granite beneath his palms. The stone was ready. The floor of the flame was set, and the firebox was rising, and the heart of the Abbey was being restored. He felt the fatigue in his joints, and the heavy ache in his lower back, but it was a good and honest tiredness. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He took a final look at the hearthstone, and he reached out to touch the silver flecks of mica one last time. He felt the vibration of the Abbey through the stone, and he felt the steady and reliable pulse of the earth. The ritual of the foundation was complete, and the ritual of the flame was waiting. Julian walked toward the exit of the great hall, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was leaving the hearth in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the rise. The preparation of the mortar was a ritual of the earth and the water, and it required a level of patience that few men outside of the Abbey could ever truly understand. Elder Julian stood at the center of the Great Refectory, and he looked at the 3 wooden barrels that held the raw ingredients for the heat-resistant bond. This was not the standard lime and sand mixture he used for the exterior walls of the library. A hearth of this magnitude required an alchemy of the fireclay, and the volcanic ash, and the fine silica sand. Julian reached into the first barrel, and he pulled out a handful of the red mountain clay. It was dry and crumbly, and it carried the scent of the deep veins of the mountain bone. He allowed the clay to slide through his fingers, and he felt the immense potential for the transformation. He began the process of the sifting. Before the clay could be mixed with the water, it had to be refined to a state of absolute purity. Julian used a fine mesh screen made of copper wire, and he began to pass the clay through the small and regular openings. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the hall. The dust from the clay rose in small and pale clouds, and it settled into the fine lines of his knuckles and the dark creases of his palms. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the dust was a sign of the work, and he treated it with a quiet and profound reverence. He watched as the red powder gathered in the bottom of the mixing tub, and he felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the mineral. Next, he added the volcanic ash. This was the material that would give the mortar its ability to expand and contract without cracking under the intense heat of the flame. The ash was a deep and velvet gray, and it was as fine as the soot from the chimney throat. Julian mixed the ash with the clay, and he used a long wooden paddle to stir the two minerals together. The sound was a soft and dry rustle, a melody of the masonry that spoke of the ancient fires of the mountain. He added the final ingredient, which was the silica sand. The sand was clear and sharp, and it provided the structural skeleton for the bond. Julian spent a long time ensuring that the proportions were perfect, for the mortar of the hearth had to be both a servant and a master of the flame. The addition of the water was the final and most sensitive part of the ritual. Julian used a small ceramic pitcher to pour the water from the new cloister well into the mixing tub. He did not add it all at once. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and he watched as the dry minerals began to absorb the moisture. The scent of the wet earth rose up to meet him, a fresh and metallic fragrance that filled the great hall with a sense of renewal. He used his bare hands to mix the mortar, and he felt the resistance of the clay as it transformed into a thick and yielding paste. The texture was smooth and heavy, and it clung to his skin with a persistent and cooling weight. Julian worked the mixture until it was the consistency of heavy cream, and then he allowed it to rest. This was the slaking, and it was the moment where the minerals and the water became a singular and unyielding entity. While the mortar was ripening, Julian turned his attention to the great lintel. This was the massive beam of gray granite that would span the width of the firebox and carry the weight of the entire chimney breast. It was the brow of the hearth, and it was the most dangerous stone to move in the entire project. Julian stood before the lintel, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the mineral. The stone was nearly 8 feet long, and it was etched with the fine and silver grain of the granite. To lift such a weight within the confines of the refectory, Julian had to build a temporary scaffold of seasoned oak and heavy iron levers. He began the process of the bracing. He placed 2 massive oak pillars on either side of the hearth, and he used a series of wooden wedges to lock them into the floor. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence. He was building the skeleton of the lift, and he treated every joint and every wrap of the rope with the same care he gave to the stone itself. He used a heavy hemp rope to lash the lintel to a series of iron hooks, and he felt the tension in his own body as he prepared for the movement. He was the anchor of the project, and his muscles were the engine of the transformation. The lift began with a slow and steady pressure. Julian did not use the strength of his arms alone. He used the weight of his entire body, leaning his mass into the long iron lever. He felt the resistance of the gravity and the stubborn inertia of the granite. The oak scaffold began to sing under the pressure, and the wood made a high and rhythmic sound that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory. Julian did not rush the movement. He moved the lintel inch by inch, and he watched as the stone rose toward the top of the firebox. He was the listener of the weight, and he understood the way the tension changed when the balance was true. As the lintel reached the level of the supporting pillars, Julian felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room. The air was thick with the scent of the stressed wood, and the dry mineral dust, and the salt of his own exertion. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, and he looked at the stone. The granite was suspended in the center of the hall, and it looked like a silver cloud in the middle of the shadows. Julian moved to the back of the scaffold, and he began the delicate process of the seating. He had to guide the massive beam into the notches he had carved in the side walls of the firebox. He used the wooden lever to nudge the edge of the lintel, and he felt the tactile resonance of the stone as it met the masonry. He did not let go of the lever immediately. He kept his focus on the joints, and he felt for the hidden balance of the structure. He took a handful of the ripened fireclay mortar, and he spread it over the top of the supporting stones. The mortar was cool and heavy, and it felt like the pulse of the mountain against his skin. He lowered the lintel onto the bed of clay, and he watched as the weight of the granite squeezed the excess mortar from the joints. The sound was a deep and muffled thud, a resonance of finality that seemed to anchor the entire hearth to the earth. Julian stood back and he looked at the progress of the ritual. The lintel was home. The brow of the hearth was set, and the firebox was complete, and the heart of the abbey was ready for the heat. He felt the fatigue in his joints, and the heavy ache in his lower back, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He looked at his hands, and he saw the map of the day written in the red clay and the gray granite dust. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he had restored the strength of the flame. The great lintel stood as a silent sentinel over the newly restored hearth, and the silver grain of the granite seemed to absorb the flickering amber light of the abbey lanterns. The stone was set, and the mortar was slaking in the joints, but to Julian the hearth was not yet finished. It was a functional structure of weight and heat, but it lacked the spiritual anchor that would connect it to the centuries of brothers who had sat before this flame. Every major piece of masonry in the abbey carried the mark of the ancestors, and the restoration of the Great Refectory hearth required the same silent and permanent witness. Julian reached for his smallest leather roll, which he kept for the fine work of the inscription, and he felt the immense stillness of the hall settled in the marrow of his bones. He began the ritual of the mapping. Before a single strike of the hammer could be delivered, Julian had to establish the geometry of the mark. He took a small piece of white limestone chalk and he began to trace the symbol onto the center of the granite lintel. The mark of the abbey was a stylized mountain peak set within a perfect circle, and it represented the intersection of the eternal earth and the infinite sky. Julian moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the vast silence of the hall. He used a wooden compass and a straight edge to ensure that the proportions were true, and he felt the rough and crystalline texture of the granite beneath the chalk. The process of the tracing was a meditation on the history of the order. As Julian drew the lines, he thought about the first mason who had carved this mark into the foundation stones of the library, and the way the symbol had survived the frost and the wind of 300 winters. He was not just drawing a shape, he was reconnecting the hearth to the lineage of the mountain. He looked at the white lines against the dark gray of the stone, and he felt a quiet spark of satisfaction. The mark was centered and balanced, and it sat upon the brow of the fireplace like a silent blessing. He wiped the chalk dust from his fingers, and he felt the grit of the mountain as a final seal of the preparation. The carving began with the selection of the wasp-tailed chisel. This was a short and tapered tool of hardened steel that Julian had forged specifically for the fine relief work on the granite. He took a small boxwood mallet, and he moved into the center of the hearth. He did not stand on a ladder. He knelt on the great hearthstone he had laid the day before, and he felt the immense and grounding stability of the floor beneath his knees. He placed the tip of the chisel on the outer edge of the circle, and he delivered the first strike. The sound was a high and rhythmic ring, a silver melody that echoed through the high vaults of the refectory and announced the beginning of the transformation. Julian worked with a precision that left no room for error. Granite is a stubborn and unforgiving material, and a single strike that was too heavy could cause a fracture in the grain of the stone. He moved in a slow and steady circle, and his hands were dark and powerful against the silver gray of the lintel. He was not removing large pieces of the mineral. He was etching the history into the stone. He used the chisel to create a shallow V-shaped groove, and he watched as the fine silver powder of the granite began to fill the lines of the mark. He felt the vibration of the steel in the palm of his hand, and he understood that the stone was finally beginning to accept the will of the mason. The physical toll of the carving was different from the heavy labor of the lift. It required a constant and intense focus that drained the energy of the mind as much as the strength of the body. Julian felt the pull in his forearms and the steady ache in his neck as he leaned forward to inspect the depth of the cut. He did not rush the movement. He was the listener of the grain, and he waited for the stone to reveal its secrets. He used a soft brush to clear the dust from the groove, and he felt the smooth and cold surface of the granite beneath his fingertips. The mark was starting to emerge from the stone, a shadow of the mountain in the middle of the abbey. Once the outline of the symbol was established, Julian moved to the relief work. He began to carve away the background of the circle to make the mountain peak stand out in a bold and powerful silhouette. This was the most time-consuming part of the ritual, for it required thousands of small and precise strikes to achieve an even depth across the surface of the granite. Julian moved his mallet in a rhythmic and melodic cadence, and the sound of the steel against the stone was a constant and calming presence in the hall. He was the focus point of the transformation, and his entire world was reduced to the space between the chisel and the grain. The dust from the carving was a fine and brilliant powder that coated his dark skin and turned his knuckles into a landscape of mineral history. He looked at the contrast between the deep tone of his arms and the silver white of the granite dust, and he felt a profound sense of connection to the mountain. He was a man of the earth, and he was giving his own vitality to the stone to ensure that the memory of the abbey remained permanent. He thought about the brothers who would look at this mark during the long winter evenings, and the way the symbol would provide a point of focus for their prayers. He was building a bridge of the spirit, and the granite was the medium of the crossing. By the time the sun had reached the western horizon, the relief work was nearly complete. The mountain peak stood out from the lintel with a majestic and unshakable presence, and the circle was a perfect and unbroken boundary. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the mark, and he saw the way the shadows of the evening were settling into the grooves of the stone. The symbol looked as though it had always been a part of the granite, as though the mountain had been waiting for the mason to reveal its hidden face. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. The heart of the abbey was now not only restored in its function, but also in its spirit. The final part of the carving was the polishing. Julian took a piece of fine grit sandstone and a small amount of oil, and he began to rub the surface of the mark. He moved in a slow and circular motion, and he felt the texture of the granite changing from the rough and jagged surface of the carving to a smooth and lustrous finish. The oil brought out the deep and rich colors of the mineral, and the silver mica began to gleam with a new and vibrant energy. He worked the oil into the grooves of the mountain peak, and he watched as the symbol began to glow in the dim light of the great hall. He spent a long time ensuring that the edges of the mark were sharp and the background was even. He used a linen cloth to wipe away the excess oil, and he felt the immense finality of the work. The mark was done. The brow of the hearth was no longer a blank and silent stone. It was a testament to the history and the continuity of the abbey. Julian stood up, and he stretched his back, and he felt the release of the tension in his shoulders. He was tired, and his robes were stained with the gray dust and the black soot, but he was satisfied. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he had fulfilled his purpose for the day. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower, and the sound traveled through the refectory as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final rest. He looked at the mark on the lintel one last time, and he felt the vibration of the stones still lingering in his palms. The ritual of the carving was complete, and the ritual of the fire was waiting. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the exit, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk, and he knew that the stones were ready for the flame. The Great Refectory was a vast and silent cathedral of shadow as the final light of the evening faded from the high windows and the silver frost began to thicken on the exterior of the stone walls. Elder Julian stood before the newly restored hearth of the ancestors, and he felt the immense stillness of the abbey settling into the marrow of his bones. The fire bricks were set, and the great granite lintel was carved, and the hearthstone was leveled, but the masonry was still cold, and the fireclay mortar was heavy with the moisture of the preparation. Before the heart of the abbey could be truly returned to the community, Julian had to perform the ritual of the first curing fire. This was the slow and patient awakening of the stone, a gentle introduction of the heat that would ensure the permanence of the bond. He began the process of the ignition. He reached for a small bundle of dry cedar shavings and several thin splints of mountain pine which had been seasoned in the high woodshop of Master Silas for over 3 years. The wood was as light as a feather, and it carried the sharp and sweet scent of the forest and the ancient resins. Julian knelt on the great hearthstone, and he placed the tinder in the center of the firebox. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the hall. He was not just building a fire, he was inviting the spirit of the warmth to return to the stone. He felt the cold texture of the granite beneath his knees, and he welcomed the immense stability of the foundation he had built. He took a small iron striker and a piece of gray mountain flint, and he delivered a single and measured blow. A tiny and brilliant spark fell into the center of the cedar shavings, and for a long moment the refectory was perfectly still. Then a thin and silver ribbon of smoke began to rise, and the scent of the burning wood filled the air with the fragrance of memory and renewal. Julian watched as the spark became a glow, and the glow became a small and dancing flame of amber light. He added the pine splints one by one, and he watched as the fire began to take hold of the mineral world. It was not a roar of heat, but a low and steady warmth, a gentle and constant energy that was designed to penetrate the heart of the masonry without causing a fracture. The mortar in the joints of the firebricks was still damp, and the intense heat of a large fire would turn the moisture into steam and shatter the work of the season. The curing fire had to be a master of the patience. Julian sat back on his heels, and he watched as the amber light of the flame played over the surface of the new bricks and the silver grain of the lintel. He saw the shadows settling into the deep grooves of the Ancestor's mark, and he felt the presence of the centuries of brothers who had sat before this same hearth. The stone was absorbing the heat, and the moisture was being driven out in a slow and invisible mist. Julian was the guardian of the transition, and he understood that the silence of the stone was never empty. As the fire grew to a steady and reliable bed of coals, the air in the great hall began to change. The sharp and crystalline cold of the frost was pushed back by a soft and radiant energy that felt like the pulse of the mountain itself. Julian reached out, and he touched the edge of the hearthstone, and he felt the first hints of the warmth. It was a subtle and living sensation, a physical evidence of the restoration. He thought about the sunstones he had cast and the way they were now holding the heat and preparing to guard the brothers through the long winter nights. He felt a deep sense of connection to the future of the Abbey. The hearth was no longer a cold and broken void. It was a sanctuary of sound and light. Once the curing fire was settled into its rhythmic work, Julian began the final restoration of the space. He moved with a slow and measured gait, and he gathered his tools and his canvas drop cloths with a meticulous care. He used a soft brush to remove the final traces of the fireclay dust and the granite grit from the polished floor of the refectory. He worked with the quiet intensity of a man who was finishing a long and sacred prayer. He checked the tension of the lintel and the level of the hearthstone one last time, and he felt the immense finality of the work. The heart of the Abbey was whole, and the spirit of the masonry was true, and the ritual of the season was complete. He walked to the large copper basin near the kitchen entrance, and he dipped his hands into the cold water. He washed away the red clay and the black soot and the silver dust of the carving, and he watched as the water became a dark map of the day's labor. He splashed the water over his face and his neck, and he felt the weight of the masonry lifting from his spirit. The air in the hall was now warm and comfortable, and the scent of the cedar smoke was a soothing presence. Julian dried his hands with a linen cloth, and he looked at his palms. They were dark and powerful, and they were the instruments of the stone. He was ready for the rest. The walk to his cell was a slow and rhythmic journey through the silver moonlight of the cloister. The frost was thick on the cobblestones, and the air was sharp and cold, but Julian carried the warmth of the hearth in the center of his chest. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and he felt the stillness of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment. He reached the heavy oak door of his cell, and he pushed it open with a steady pressure. The room was dark and cool, and it smelled of old dust and dry straw. He did not light a candle. He moved through the shadows with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the granite walls. He removed his heavy robes, and he felt the sudden release of the tension in his shoulders and his back. He was tired and his joints were heavy with the ache of the labor, but it was a good and satisfying fatigue. He sat on the edge of the straw pallet, and he looked at the narrow window where the moon was a brilliant disk in the dark sky. He thought about the wall and the well and the hearth, and he felt the beauty of the continuity. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was the anchor of the abbey. He had given his vitality to the earth, and the earth had given him the gift of the permanence. He lay back on the pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the high meadows, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He closed his eyes and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the marrow of his bones. He saw the glow of the fire, and the mark of the ancestors, and the rising of the smoke. He was at peace. The foundation was secure and the masonry was true, and the builder was finally ready to find his own silence. The night was holding the watch, and the mountain was still, and the heart of the abbey was warm. And in that quietude he slept.